Professor Matthews did not attend the Congress of the People in Kliptown in June 1955 because the students at Fort Hare, where he was a principal, were on strike at that time. He was one of the accused of the treason trial in 1956, becoming an articulate spokesperson and presenting a strong defense of the Freedom Charter, where he denied that the Charter is a communist document. The communists did not form the Charter, it was formed by the Africans. For Matthews, the Charter was an extension of the Africans' claims. Its role was to refine the Africans' claims and to explain the conditions of government in a free, united, and democratic South Africa. As to its content, the Charter repeated many of the statements of rights contained in the Africans' claims. Unlike the Africans' claims, which placed emphasis on individual liberties, the Charter's prime occupation was the economic sphere, proclaiming that the national wealth of our country, the heritage of all South Africans, shall be restored to the people. The mineral wealth beneath the soil, the banks and monopoly industry shall be transferred to the ownership of the people as a whole. Industry and trade would be controlled to assist the well-being of the people. The land would be redivided amongst those who work it. There would be work and security. Men and women of all races would receive equal pay for equal work. The Charter promised houses, security, and comfort, and to use unused housing space for homeless people. It would provide free medical care and hospitalization to all people, with special care for mothers and young children. Slums would be demolished and new suburbs with transport, roads, lighting, playing fields, creches, and social centers built. Orphans, the aged, the disabled, and the sick would be cared for by the state. A combination of the social and economic aims of the Charter and the individual liberties of the Africans' claims would form the bedrock of the late 20th century liberation rhetoric of the ANC. By the early 1990s, the collapse of the whites-only regime had become inevitable, although they will say they did us a favor by exiting the space. But the fact that the government was collapsing on its own, they forget conveniently. But what would replace it was still contentious. For its part, the ANC returned to its roots and rekindled the spirit of the Constitution, the spirit of the Bill of Rights, the spirit of universal franchise, a government based on the will of the people and a commitment to social and economic justice. These ideas would then be the epicenter of the new constitutional vision. But more still had to be done. The political power of the majority would be constrained by the power of the law. A new idea of constitutional supremacy entered the lexicon of the ANC. This was not hard to embrace, even as communist dogma had some influence in some of the policies of the time. Experiences of unrestrained despotic white power under apartheid were still fresh in the imagination of the men of the movement. Although the judges were unelected, they were seen as an essential check on the power of elected government. I can ask now the first of the questions which I intended to ask in this lecture. One of the most important ideas in the Constitution is equality. In simple terms, the Constitution intends to end inequality. Inequality, in turn, manifests in different forms, including race, gender, economic, social, and cultural. Racism and inequality are therefore inextricably bound. In 2018, the World Bank noted that South Africa is the most unequal society in the world, with 76% of the population living in poverty. 30% of the population is chronically poor. An overwhelming number of those classified as non-poor face the risk of slipping into the chronically poor category. Race, gender, and income disparity explain the depth of South Africa's inequality. Africans are at the highest risk of being poor. Children, large families, and people living in rural areas are especially vulnerable to remaining impoverished for lengthy periods. Poverty is also gendered, concluded the World Bank. The incidence of poverty is higher, or perhaps highest, for African women. Most municipalities in the 20 poorest local municipalities are in the Eastern Cape, Limpopo, and KwaZulu-Natal. So poverty also has a geographic location. Of these, the 10 poorest municipalities are in the former homelands, thus highlighting the enduring legacy of apartheid. We have become accustomed to the notion that education will end poverty. That's certainly what my mother believed. This was the idea behind universalizing access to education, which has meant that an incredible number of black children have access to both secondary and university education. The hope is that education will take us out of poverty. But the World Bank has shown that while education can contribute to poverty reduction, it is asset distribution that is a stronger indicator of who is poor and who is not. This is what they said. For the poor, the financial assets represent 36% of total assets, while among the rich, financial assets represent 75%. Furthermore, ownership of financial assets features prominently among the factors that influence wealth inequality. What this means is that we do not need education instead of redistribution. To make a decisive break with the trappings of the past, we need both. The future for the poor is also bleak, according to the World Bank. That is because wealth and poverty transfer across generations. At least a third of all children born to very poor parents will likely remain poor themselves, while children of rich parents will likely become rich. So wealth calcifies at the top and does not automatically trickle down. Since generally whites are at the top and Africans at the bottom of the economic ladder, the calcification of wealth means the continuation of white wealth and black poverty, unless there is a fundamental reorganization of the economic structures which changes the paradigm in favor of poor black South Africans. Not only do we face a crisis of inequality, recent data shows a regression from the initial achievements of the first decade of democracy. Only in November 2023, the journalist Estelle Ellis of the Daily Maverick published a story which showed that between August 2022 and September 2023, there were 1,722 cases of malnutrition in children in the Eastern Cape. Of these malnourished children, 101 had died, as did another 13 who were diagnosed with moderate to severe acute malnutrition. There were also thousands more who presented with symptoms of malnutrition. If the data from Daily Maverick is to be perceived as anecdotal, it is also confirmed by the South African Human Rights Commission, which reported in 2022 that at least 25% of children born in the Eastern Cape are stunted. The problem of lack of access to food is slow violence. It is also structural because we live in a country of plenty. In a country of massive food wastage, it is violent because we can end malnutrition, but we have children dying of hunger and starvation. Unlike the malnourished children of the Eastern Cape, many of us have a lot more. This is why it is fair to refer to it as structural violence. It's deliberate violence on the poor. Of course, this is not the full story. Sambi Teblanche argued that one of the most remarkable developments in the first years of the democratic state has been the enrichment of the top 20% of African households and the simultaneous impoverishment of the bottom 40%. While the income of the top 20% of African households, about 6 million people, increased by more than 60%, that of the bottom 40%, that is 18 million people, declined by almost 60%. In certain quarters, there is some criticism about the emergence of the so-called black elite. Teblanche, however, considers this development a healthy phenomenon, without which a new South Africa would not have been possible. But I argue that this development underscores a broader issue, that the development of the black elite has coincided with the development of a black underclass. Current discourses on inequality tend to mask the truth of the superclass-underclass dynamic that is South Africa's reality. While the evidence of a causal connection, or what in law we call causal nexus, between these two phenomena is unclear. They can both be seen as byproducts of societal transformation. The upward mobility of some black people is explained by the shift in political power from white minority rule to a representative government, which opened the possibilities of social and economic advancement where they previously did not exist. The explanation, however, for the deterioration in the living standards of the black underclass presents certain complexities. It can be explained by apartheid racism or its endurance. Governmental and institutional collapse, we've seen a lot of evidence on this.